In the last 5 lectures, we traced the English novel from its origins in prose narrative through its 18th century foundations and its consolidation in the 19th century in the novel of manners, the Victorian social realism, the Bildungsroman, and its Gothic manifestations. In this final lecture, we turn to what follows, the transformation of the novel as realism can no longer fully contain experience. The focus here is not on the abandonment of realism, but its reworking, as the novel moves toward new forms of consciousness, authority, and narrative design. By the end of the 19th century, the novel faces a structural problem rather than a thematic one. Earlier realism assumed that society was intelligible, that moral judgment was possible, and that narrative could mediate between individual experience and social meaning. These assumptions no longer hold. Experience appears fragmented, moral certainty weakens, and authority becomes difficult to locate. The question facing the novel is no longer what to represent, but how representation itself can function when perception is limited, when knowledge is partial, and when meaning is unstable. Modern fiction emerges as a response to this crisis. Henry James marks a decisive shift in the novel's center of gravity from social representation to consciousness itself. External action recedes as moral meaning becomes dependent on perception, interpretation, and hesitation. Experience is no longer presented as transparent or as self-evident, but as filtered through limited awareness. Narrative authority narrows, focusing on what characters can know rather than what society objectively is. James doesn't abandon realism. He transforms the novel into an exploration of moral perception under conditions of uncertainty. The novel becomes quieter, slower, and more inward, yet remains ethically serious. With Joseph Conrad, uncertainty extends beyond consciousness to narration itself. Stories are mediated through layered voices, delayed revelation, and unreliable authority. Moral meaning becomes difficult to stabilize, not because characters lack sincerity, but because events unfold within systems of power, violence, and historical disruption. Experience appears fractured and morally opaque. Conrad's realism exposes the limits of explanation, showing how storytelling can distort as much as reveal. The novel no longer offers judgment with confidence. Instead, it registers ambiguity, disorientation, and ethical instability. Narrative becomes an inquiry into the possibility and the impossibility of understanding. D.H. Lawrence responds to the crisis of realism by rejecting intellectual mediation in favor of instinct, desire, and bodily experience. For Lawrence, modern society represses vitality, emotion, and authentic connection. The novel becomes a means of recovery rather than explanation, seeking truth in sensation and lived intensity rather than moral reflection or social analysis. Consciousness is no longer analytical, but visceral. Lawrence's fiction challenges Victorian restraint and psychological distance, insisting that meaning arises from physical and emotional immediacy. This marks a break with the moral frameworks of earlier realism. James Joyce transforms the novel by rethinking its fundamental structures, plot, narration, time, and language itself. External realism gives way to interior monologue, fragmented chronology, and radical formal play. Experience is rendered directly, without explanatory mediation. Meaning arises through linguistic pattern, memory, and association, rather than through moral commentary or narrative control. Joyce doesn't abandon ordinary life. He subjects it to unprecedented formal intensity. The novel becomes an experimental space in which consciousness, language, and culture intersect without hierarchy or closure. Virginia Woolf reshaped the novel around perception, memory, and temporal fluidity. external events matter less than the rhythms of consciousness and movement of thought. Time is experienced subjectively rather than sequentially, and narrative coherence arises from emotional and psychological continuity rather than plot. Woolf's fiction rejects Victorian solidity and authority, yet remains deeply attentive to ordinary experience. The novel becomes a form capable of capturing fleeting moments, shared perception, and inner connection. Realism survives here not as description, but as sensitivity to lived mental life. These writers don't represent a single movement, but a shared transformation. Authority weakens, form becomes experimental, and consciousness replaces social structure as the novel's organizing principle. What unites these novels or these novelists is not style, but necessity. Realism must change in order to continue. The novel survives by reinventing itself, extending its original openness into new formal and psychological territories. What began as a flexible prose form, grounded in ordinary life, becomes a field of continuous experimentation. The history traced across this lecture reveals the novel not as a stable genre, but as a form defined by change. From its uncertain beginning to this modern transformation, the novel evolves by responding to social, moral, and psychological pressures. Each phase throughout the video or throughout the lectures inherits tensions from the last one and reshapes them into new narrative possibilities. In this sense, modernism, highlighted in this lecture, doesn't break with the novel's past, but fulfills its deeper principle, adaptability. The English novel endures not by settling, but by transforming.